The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that day. 23 years of service had taught him that every detail mattered when, standing guard at one of the world's most famous residences. His black bearskin hat sat perfectly positioned, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle, and his boots gleamed like mirrors in the London sunlight. James had seen it all during his time as a palace guard. Tourists trying to climb the gates, protesters with their colorful signs, and countless photographers hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty. Most days passed without incident, filled with the familiar rhythm of changing guards, ceremonial duties, and the constant stream of visitors who came to witness the pageantry of British tradition. But this Tuesday morning felt different somehow. The air carried an unusual tension, though James couldn't quite put his finger on what was causing his unease. Perhaps it was the way certain visitors lingered too long near the gates, or how some tourists seemed more interested in studying the guards than taking pictures. His military training had taught him to trust these instincts, and something was definitely not right. The crowd gathered as usual for the morning ceremony. Families with excited children pressed against the railings, cameras ready to capture the famous red-coated guards. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a man whose appearance seemed unremarkable at first glance. Average height, brown hair, wearing tourist clothes that helped him blend seamlessly into the crowd. But Marcus was far from an ordinary visitor. 3 months earlier, Marcus had been released from prison after serving 5 years for armed robbery. The transition back to civilian life had been brutal. No job would hire him with his criminal record. His family had abandoned him, and his small apartment in East London felt more like another prison cell than a home. Anger and desperation had been building inside him like pressure in a steam kettle, and today that pressure was about to explode. Marcus had spent weeks studying the palace routines, timing the guard changes and observing the security measures. He knew exactly when the guards would be most vulnerable, when the crowds would be thickest, and how he might exploit the chaos that would follow his planned action. His plan wasn't sophisticated, but it was born from desperation and a twisted desire to make the world pay attention to his suffering. As James stood at his post, he noticed Marcus among the crowd. There was something about the way the man moved, the intensity in his eyes, and how he kept checking his watch that triggered every alarm bell in the sergeant's experienced mind. James had learned to read people during his military service in Afghanistan, and this man radiated the same dangerous energy he'd seen in hostile territories. The ceremony began as it had thousands of times before. The band played their traditional tunes while tourists snapped photos and children pointed excitedly at the guards. James maintained his stoic expression while his eyes continuously scanned the crowd, paying special attention to Marcus, who had moved closer to the front of the gathering. What James didn't know was that Marcus had chosen today specifically because it was his daughter's birthday. The daughter who no longer spoke to him, who had changed her last name to distance herself from his criminal past. In Marcus's twisted logic, creating chaos at one of Britain's most sacred institutions would somehow prove to the world that he mattered, that his pain was real and significant. As the crowd grew thicker, Marcus began pushing forward, using his elbows to force his way through families and tourists. His heart pounded with adrenaline, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The moment he had planned for weeks was finally approaching, and there would be no turning back once he set his plan in motion. James noticed the man's aggressive movement through the crowd and subtly shifted his position to get a better view. Something about Marcus's behavior reminded him of insurgents he'd encountered overseas, people who carried themselves with the dangerous confidence of someone about to commit violence. The sergeant's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his rifle as his training kicked in. The ceremony continued around them, but for James and Marcus, everything else began to fade into the background. It was as if an invisible thread connected them, predator and protector, locked in a dance that neither fully understood yet. James couldn't arrest someone for simply looking suspicious, but every instinct screamed that this man posed a threat to everyone present. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and felt the cold metal of the knife he'd brought. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it would serve his purpose. His plan was simple in its desperation: grab a guard's rifle and create enough chaos to ensure his story would dominate news headlines around the world. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. Prison, death, or worse meant nothing to a man who felt he had already lost everything worth living for. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony reached its climax, providing Marcus with the cover he needed. James watched the suspicious man's every move, noting how his right hand remained hidden in his jacket and how his eyes had taken on the glazed look of someone preparing for violence. The sergeant began calculating distances, response times, and potential courses of action should his suspicions prove correct. In that moment, neither man could have predicted how the next few minutes would unfold, or how their lives would become forever intertwined by the events about to transpire. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every lesson James had learned in his military career and push Marcus beyond the point of no return in his desperate quest for recognition. The moment arrived with the suddenness of lightning striking. Marcus Thompson lunged forward through the crowd, pushing aside a small child and an elderly woman as he made his desperate move toward Sergeant James Mitchell. The knife in his hand caught the morning sunlight as he raised it above his head, letting out a guttural yell that cut through the ceremonial music like a blade through silk. "Give me your gun!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. "Everyone needs to see what you people have done to me." The crowd's reaction was immediate and chaotic. Children began crying as their parents grabbed them protectively. Tourists scattered in all directions, their cameras forgotten as survival instincts took over. Some people froze in terror, unable to process what was happening, while others screamed and ran toward the palace gates seeking safety. But James Mitchell was not an ordinary target. 23 years of military and guard duty had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. As Marcus approached with the knife raised, James didn't panic or retreat. Instead, he drew upon decades of training that had become as natural as breathing. In one fluid motion, James stepped slightly to his left while bringing his rifle up in a defensive position. The movement was so practiced, so automatic, that it seemed almost choreographed. As Marcus reached for the weapon, still screaming his demands, James used the rifle's stock to deflect the knife attack while simultaneously pivoting his body to avoid the blade's path. Marcus had expected the guard to be caught off guard, to stumble backward in fear like the tourists around them. Instead, he found himself facing a trained soldier who moved with the precision and confidence of someone who had faced real combat. The knife missed its target entirely, and Marcus stumbled forward, off balance and confused by the guard's unexpected response. What happened next would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world for weeks to come. Instead of using his rifle to strike Marcus or calling for backup, James Mitchell made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. As Marcus stumbled, James reached out with his free hand and grabbed the man's wrist, not to hurt him, but to steady him and prevent him from falling into the crowd. "Easy there, mate," James said calmly, his voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected gentleness. "Let's talk about this." Marcus found himself face to face with the guard, close enough to see the man's eyes beneath the ceremonial bearskin hat. He had expected anger, fear, or aggression, but instead found something completely unexpected: compassion. James was looking at him not as a threat to be neutralized, but as a human being in obvious pain. The knife was still in Marcus's hand, but somehow the fight had gone out of him. The guard's unexpected response had completely derailed his plan. He had prepared for violence, for confrontation, for a battle that would end with his story dominating the headlines. Instead, he found himself being treated with a dignity he hadn't experienced in years. "I just want people to know," Marcus said, his voice breaking as tears began streaming down his face. "Nobody cares that I exist. My own daughter won't talk. To me, I lost everything and nobody cares." Around them, the chaos continued. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer by the second. Other guards had moved to secure the area while tourists continued to flee. But in the small space between James and Marcus, an entirely different kind of drama was unfolding. James kept his hand on Marcus's wrist, not restraining him, but maintaining a human connection. He had seen this same look in the eyes of soldiers, suffering from trauma, in prisoners of war who had given up hope, in civilians caught in conflict zones who had lost everything that mattered to them. It was the look of someone who had reached the absolute bottom and could see no way back up. "I hear you," James said quietly, speaking just loud enough for Marcus to understand him over the surrounding noise. "I can see you're hurting, but this isn't the way, mate. This won't bring your daughter back or make your pain go away." Marcus's grip on the knife began to loosen. The weapon that had seemed so important just moments before now felt heavy and pointless in his hand. The guard's words were reaching him in a way that months of counseling and social services had failed to do. Police officers were now rushing toward them, their weapons drawn and voices shouting commands. James could see them approaching from his peripheral vision, and he knew that the window for a peaceful resolution was rapidly closing. Once the officers reached them, standard procedure would take over, and Marcus would likely be tackled to the ground and arrested with considerable force. "Listen to me carefully," James said urgently, his voice taking on the tone of command he had used with soldiers under his command. "In about 10 seconds, those officers are going to be here, and they're going to see a man with a knife threatening a guard. If you want this to end differently than you planned, you need to drop that knife right now and put your hands up." Marcus looked into the guard's eyes and saw something he hadn't seen in years: genuine concern for his welfare. This man who had every right to hate him, who could have easily hurt him in self-defense, was instead trying to save him from making an even bigger mistake. The knife clattered to the ground as Marcus raised his hands above his head. The sound of metal hitting pavement seemed to echo through the courtyard, marking the end of his desperate plan and the beginning of something entirely unexpected. As the police officers reached them, James stepped slightly in front of Marcus, his body language protective rather than aggressive. "He's surrendered," James called out to his colleagues. "The weapon is on the ground. He's cooperating." What had begun as an attempted armed robbery had transformed into something entirely different, something that would challenge everything. Both men thought they knew about justice, redemption, and the power of human compassion in the darkest of moments. The arrest happened with surprising gentleness, thanks largely to James Mitchell's intervention. As the police officers approached with weapons drawn, James continued to stand protectively near Marcus, his presence serving as a buffer between the desperate man and the aggressive response that typically followed such incidents. He dropped the weapon voluntarily, James explained to Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh, who had arrived as the senior officer on scene. "He's not resisting. I think he needs help more than punishment." Detective Walsh had seen hundreds of similar cases during her 15 years on the force, but something about the guard's behavior puzzled her. Victims of attempted armed robbery didn't usually advocate for their attackers' gentle treatment. She studied both men carefully as Marcus was handcuffed and read his rights. Marcus Thompson didn't struggle or protest as he was led away. Instead, he kept looking back at James with an expression of confusion and something that might have been gratitude. The guard had given him something he hadn't expected: respect and dignity in his moment of complete failure. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, cell phone footage of the incident had spread across social media platforms worldwide. The headline, "Criminal Grabs Weapon from Palace Guard," appeared on news websites in dozens of languages, but the story that emerged was far more complex than the simple crime description suggested. James found himself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. News reporters camped outside his modest London flat, eager to interview the guard who had shown such unexpected compassion to his attacker. Phone calls from television producers, book publishers, and movie studios flooded his answering machine. Everyone wanted to understand what had motivated his remarkable response. "I just did what felt right," James told his commanding officer during the mandatory debriefing. The man was clearly in pain. Hurting him more wasn't going to solve anything. But James's simple explanation didn't satisfy the media's hunger for drama. News stories began painting him as either a hero or a fool, depending on the political leanings of the publication. Some praised his compassionate response as an example of British values at their finest, while others criticized him for showing weakness when faced with a criminal threat. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson sat in his holding cell facing charges of attempted armed robbery, assault, and threatening a public official. His court-appointed lawyer, Patricia Chen, was a young woman fresh out of law school who had drawn the short straw on what seemed like an impossible case. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," Patricia explained during their first meeting. "There's video footage, dozens of witnesses, and you were caught with the weapon. The prosecution is asking for 8 to 12 years, and honestly, I don't see much room for negotiation." Marcus nodded numbly. He had expected this outcome, but somehow it felt different now. The guard's act of kindness had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. Hope. For the first time since his release from prison, he found himself thinking about the possibility of a different future. "Can I write a letter to the guard?" Marcus asked. "To thank him?" Patricia was surprised by the request. Most of her clients wanted to blame their victims or minimize their crimes. This was the first time someone had asked to express gratitude to the person they had attacked. James received Marcus's letter 3 days later, forwarded through official channels with multiple security warnings attached. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone unaccustomed to expressing himself on paper. "Dear Sergeant Mitchell," the letter began, "I don't know why you helped me when you had every right to hurt me. Nobody has treated me like a human being in so long that I forgot that's what I was. I know I can't take back what I did, but I want you to know that your kindness saved me from becoming something even worse than I already was. Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself." The letter went on for 3 pages, describing Marcus's childhood, his struggles with addiction, his failed marriage, and his desperate attempt to reconnect with his estranged daughter. It painted a picture of a man who had made terrible choices but wasn't inherently evil. James read the letter several times, each reading revealing new layers of pain and regret. Against his better judgment, he found himself caring about what happened to Marcus Thompson. The man's crime had been serious, but his remorse seemed genuine, and James couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be a better solution than simply locking him away for another decade. That evening, James did something that surprised even himself. He called Marcus's lawyer and requested a meeting. Patricia Chen was shocked by the request but agreed to arrange it, sensing an opportunity she couldn't quite define. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the courthouse, with Patricia present to ensure everything remained legal and proper. Marcus was brought in wearing prison clothes and shackles, a far cry from the tourist disguise he had worn during the attack. "I got your letter," James said simply, as Marcus sat down across from him. "I wanted to understand why you did what you did." For the next hour, Marcus told his story in detail. He spoke about growing up in poverty, about making increasingly poor choices as a young man, about the armed robbery that had sent him to prison, and about the crushing loneliness and despair that had driven him to his desperate act at the palace. James listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just letting Marcus speak. It was clear that this was the first time in years that anyone had truly listened to the man's story without immediately condemning him. "I know I deserve whatever punishment I get," Marcus concluded. "But I want you to know that what you did changed something in me. For the first time in years, I feel like maybe there's still some good left in the world." As James walked home, that evening he found himself thinking about second chances, about the thin line between desperation and evil, and about whether the justice system was really serving anyone by simply warehousing people like Marcus Thompson. An idea was beginning to form in his mind, something unprecedented that would challenge everything both men thought they knew about crime and punishment. James Mitchell made a decision that would shock everyone involved in the case, including himself. After sleepless nights thinking about Marcus Thompson's letter and their courthouse meeting, he decided to do something that had never been done before in the history of British jurisprudence. He would ask the court to allow him to take personal responsibility for Marcus's rehabilitation. The idea came to him while reading about traditional justice systems in other cultures, where victims and offenders worked together to heal the harm caused by crime. It was called restorative justice, and while it existed in some forms within the British system, nothing as radical as what James was proposing had ever been attempted in a case involving attempted armed robbery. James contacted Patricia Chen and explained his unprecedented proposal. He wanted to petition the court to allow Marcus to be released into his custody instead of serving a lengthy prison sentence. In exchange, James would personally supervise Marcus's rehabilitation, help him find employment, and ensure he attended counseling and community service. Patricia was speechless when James finished explaining his plan. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said carefully, "what you're proposing is extraordinary, but I'm not sure it's legally possible. The prosecution is demanding serious jail time, and the judge has little precedent for this kind of arrangement." "Then we'll create a precedent," James replied with the quiet determination that had served him well during his military career. "If our justice system is supposed to be about rehabilitation and not just punishment, then this is our chance to prove it actually works." The proposal created a media firestorm when it became public. Legal experts debated its merits on television, talk shows, while social media erupted with arguments for and against James's plan. Some praised him as a visionary who understood the true meaning of justice, while others condemned him as naive and potentially dangerous. Marcus Thompson was stunned when Patricia explained James's offer. "He wants to help me?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "After what I tried to do to him?" "More than help," Patricia explained. "He's willing to stake his own reputation, and possibly his career, on the belief that you can change. The question is, can you prove him right?" The hearing that would determine Marcus's fate took place on a gray London morning 3 weeks later. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and curious members of the public who had been following the case. Judge Margaret Thornton, known for her fair but firm approach to criminal justice, would make the final decision. The prosecution argued forcefully against James's proposal. "Your Honor," stated Crown Prosecutor David Reynolds, "this man committed a serious crime with a deadly weapon in front of hundreds of witnesses, including children. To release him into the custody of his victim would set a dangerous precedent and make a mockery of our legal system." Patricia Chen countered with an impassioned defense of the restorative justice approach. She presented evidence of Marcus's genuine remorse, his clean record while in custody awaiting trial, and testimonials from counselors who had worked with him. Most importantly, she emphasized that the victim himself was requesting this alternative approach. But it was James Mitchell's testimony that would prove to be the turning point in the case. When called to the witness stand, he spoke with the same calm authority that had diffused the original confrontation. "Your Honor," James began, "I've spent 23 years serving this country, first as a soldier, and then as a palace guard. I've seen what violence does to people, both those who commit it and those who suffer from it. What I learned that day at the palace is that Marcus Thompson isn't a career criminal or a violent sociopath. He's a broken man who made a terrible decision out of desperation." James paused, looking directly at Marcus before continuing. "The traditional approach would be to lock him away for 8 to 12 years, at a cost of approximately £40,000 per year to the taxpayer. When he's released, he'll be older, more institutionalized, and likely even less equipped to reintegrate into society. We'll have spent £500,000 to make him a bigger problem than he was before." The judge listened intently as James outlined his proposal in detail. He would provide Marcus with housing in a small flat above his garage, help him find employment, ensure he attended regular counseling sessions, and supervise 100 hours of community service. Marcus would be required to wear an electronic monitoring device and report to probation officers weekly. But most importantly, James continued, he would have someone who believes in his ability to change, someone who sees him as more than just his worst mistake. I believe that's what rehabilitation really means, helping someone remember who they were meant to be before life knocked them down. Marcus was then allowed to address the court. His voice shook as he spoke about his gratitude for James's unprecedented offer and his commitment to proving worthy of such trust. "I know I don't deserve this chance," Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. "But if your honor grants it to me, I swear I will spend the rest of my life making sure Sergeant Mitchell never regrets his decision." Judge Thornton recessed the court for 2 hours to consider the unprecedented request. Legal experts in the gallery debated the possible implications, while Marcus sat in his holding cell, hardly daring to hope that such an extraordinary outcome was possible. When court reconvened, Judge Thornton delivered a ruling that would be studied in law schools for decades to come. This case presents us with a unique opportunity to test whether our stated commitment to rehabilitation is genuine or merely rhetorical, she began. While the defendant's crime was serious and cannot be minimized, the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this case, including the victim's remarkable response and the defendant's apparent genuine remorse, warrant an equally extraordinary approach to justice. The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Thornton continued. I am therefore sentencing Marcus Thompson to 5 years imprisonment, suspended on the condition that he complies fully with the rehabilitation program proposed by Sergeant Mitchell. This is not mercy, she emphasized. This is an experiment. In true justice, and everyone involved should understand that failure is not an option. As the gavel fell, ending the most unusual court case in recent British legal history, Marcus Thompson found himself facing not a prison cell, but the most challenging opportunity of his life, the chance to prove that redemption was possible, even for someone who had fallen as far as he had. The first month of Marcus Thompson's unprecedented rehabilitation was harder than either man had anticipated. James had prepared the small flat above his garage with basic furniture and supplies, but he hadn't fully considered the emotional complexities of living so closely with someone who had tried to rob him at knife point. Marcus struggled with overwhelming guilt and disbelief at his situation. Every morning he woke up expecting to find himself back in a prison cell, convinced that James would come to his senses and call the police. The electronic monitoring device on his ankle served as a constant reminder of his criminal status, but also of the remarkable trust he had been given. I don't understand why you're doing this, Marcus said one evening as they sat in James's modest kitchen sharing a simple dinner. Every time I look at you, I remember what I tried to do, and I can't figure out what kind of person responds to an attack by offering help. James set down his fork and considered the question carefully. I've been thinking about that too, he admitted. I think it's because I recognized something in your eyes that day. It was the same look I saw in mirrors after my tours in Afghanistan, when I felt like the world had forgotten I existed and nothing I did mattered anymore. The revelation surprised Marcus. He had assumed that someone like James, with his distinguished military career and prestigious position as a palace guard, had never experienced the kind of despair that had driven Marcus to his desperate act. You felt like that? Marcus asked, genuine surprise in his voice. James nodded slowly. Coming back from war isn't easy. You spend months or years in a place where every decision could mean life or death, where your actions have immediate, visible consequences. Then you return to civilian life where nothing seems to matter as much, where people complain about trivial things while you're trying to forget images of real suffering. This shared understanding became the foundation of their unlikely relationship. James began sharing stories of his own struggles with readjustment, while Marcus opened up about his childhood in poverty and his gradual descent into criminal behavior. They discovered that both men had experienced the crushing weight of feeling invisible and unimportant to society. Finding Marcus employment proved to be one of their biggest challenges. Despite James's reputation and connections, most employers were reluctant to hire someone with Marcus's criminal record, especially given the high-profile nature of his case. After 3 weeks of rejections, James decided to take a different approach. We're going to start our own business, James announced one morning over breakfast. I've been thinking about this since I was discharged from the Army. Security consulting for small businesses, using our military and security experience to help people protect their properties and employees. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. You want to go into business with me? The man who tried to rob you? I want to go into business with someone who understands what it's like to feel desperate enough to make terrible choices, James corrected. Someone who knows firsthand how close any of us can come to losing everything that matters. The business idea was ambitious, but practical. James's military expertise and reputation could attract clients, while Marcus's street knowledge and life experience would help them understand the real security threats that businesses faced. They would call it second chance security, both as a description of their services and as a statement about their philosophy. Their first client was Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, an elderly widow who owned a small grocery store in a rough neighborhood. She had been robbed twice in the past year, and was considering closing the business that had been in her family for 3 generations. I heard about your story on the news, Mrs. Harper told them during their initial meeting. If a palace guard can trust a former criminal, maybe I can trust your judgment about how to protect my store. Marcus found himself in the unique position of thinking like both a potential criminal and a security consultant. He could identify vulnerabilities that James's formal training might miss, while James provided the professional expertise to address those weaknesses effectively. The problem isn't your alarm system or your cameras, Marcus explained to Mrs. Harper. It's that you're predictable. You open at the same time, close at the same time, and make your bank deposits on the same schedule, every week. Any criminal watching your store for a few days would know exactly when you're most vulnerable. Their recommendations were simple but effective. Varying routines, improving lighting in key areas, and training Mrs. Harper's employees to recognize potential threats. Within 6 months, there had been no further incidents at the store, and Mrs. Harper began referring other small business owners to Second Chance Security. Word spread quickly through London's business community about the unusual partnership between a decorated palace guard and a reformed criminal. Some clients were drawn by curiosity, but most stayed because the advice was practical and effective. Marcus's insights into criminal thinking combined with James's security expertise created a unique approach that traditional security firms couldn't match. As their business grew, so did Marcus's confidence. For the first time in years, he felt useful and valued. The electronic monitoring device was removed after 6 months of perfect compliance, and he began attending college courses in business management, funded by their growing profits. But perhaps the most significant development was Marcus's renewed relationship with his daughter, Emma. She had seen news coverage of the court case and James's remarkable gesture of forgiveness. After months of exchanging letters through Patricia Chen, Emma agreed to meet her father at a neutral location with James present as a mediator. "I don't forgive you for everything you put our family through," Emma told Marcus during their first meeting in over 2 years. "But I can see you're trying to change, and that man believes in you enough to risk his own life on your redemption. That has to count for something." The meeting was awkward and emotional, filled with years of accumulated pain and disappointment, but it was also the first step toward healing a relationship that had seemed permanently broken. Emma agreed to continue meeting with her father, with the understanding that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent effort. As Marcus's first year of supervised rehabilitation drew to a close, both men reflected on how much their lives had changed. James had found a new sense of purpose beyond his military service, while Marcus had discovered that redemption was possible even after hitting rock bottom. Their unusual partnership had grown into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of life's capacity for both devastation and renewal. 2 years after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus Thompson stood before Judge Margaret Thornton once again. This time, however, he wore a well-fitting business suit instead of prison clothes, and his demeanor radiated confidence rather than desperation. The same courtroom that had witnessed his sentencing was now hosting his final probation hearing. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Thornton began, reviewing the thick file of progress reports before her, "I must admit that when I approved Sergeant Mitchell's unconventional rehabilitation proposal, I harbored significant doubts about its potential success. Your transformation over the past 2 years has been nothing short of remarkable. The evidence of Marcus's rehabilitation was overwhelming. Second Chance Security had grown from a desperate experiment into a thriving business with 15 employees and contracts throughout London. Marcus had completed his community service hours by teaching security awareness to other former criminals seeking employment, turning his past mistakes into tools for helping others avoid similar paths. James sat in the gallery, watching his former charge with obvious pride. The transformation he had witnessed was profound and genuine. Marcus had not only avoided any further criminal activity, but had become a productive member of society, paying taxes, employing others, and contributing positively to his community. "Your Honor," Marcus addressed the court, his voice steady and confident. "2 years ago I stood in this same courtroom as a broken man who had given up on himself and society. I believed that violence was my only option for making people notice my pain and desperation. I was wrong about everything. Marcus paused, glancing toward James before continuing. Sergeant Mitchell didn't just offer me a second chance. He showed me what true strength looks like. Real courage isn't about forcing people to pay attention to your pain. It's about taking responsibility for your mistakes and working every day to become someone better than you were yesterday. The transformation extended beyond Marcus's professional life. His relationship with his daughter Emma had slowly healed through consistent effort and genuine change. She had recently accepted his invitation to Sunday dinner at the small flat above James's garage, bringing her own children to meet the grandfather they had never known. The hardest part wasn't learning to trust myself again, Marcus had told Emma during one of their reconciliation meetings. It was accepting that I deserved forgiveness from you, from society, and especially from myself. Emma's response had moved both men to tears. Dad, I can't erase what happened to our family because of your choices, but I can see that you're not the same person who made those choices. James helped you find your way back to being the father I remembered from my childhood, before everything went wrong. The success of their rehabilitation model had attracted attention from criminologists, social workers, and policymakers across Europe. James and Marcus had been invited to speak at conferences about restorative justice, sharing their story as evidence that alternatives to traditional incarceration could be effective for certain types of offenders. We're not suggesting that what we did would work for everyone, James always emphasized during these presentations. But for people whose crimes stem from desperation rather than evil, from mental health issues rather than criminal intent, there might be better solutions than simply warehousing them in overcrowded prisons. Their story had also inspired legislative discussions about expanding restorative justice programs throughout the UK. Several pilot programs based on their model were being implemented in other jurisdictions, allowing victims who chose to participate in their offenders' rehabilitation under careful supervision and strict conditions. As Judge Thornton prepared to render her final verdict on Marcus's probation, she reflected on the broader implications of the case. Mr. Thompson, your successful rehabilitation raises important questions about how our society addresses crime and punishment. Your case demonstrates that with proper support, genuine remorse, and extraordinary commitment from both victim and offender, even serious crimes need not define a person's entire future. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. Marcus Thompson, you have successfully completed all conditions of your suspended sentence. Your probation is hereby terminated, and you are restored to full citizenship without restrictions. This court commends both you and Sergeant Mitchell for proving that justice can be both firm and compassionate. The courtroom erupted in applause as Marcus and James embraced, their unlikely friendship having survived the ultimate test. Patricia Chen, now a successful defense attorney who specialized in restorative justice cases, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her former client celebrate his complete legal freedom. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for what would be the final press conference about their extraordinary story. Marcus had grown comfortable speaking publicly about his transformation, using his platform to advocate for criminal justice reform and second-chance employment programs. 3 years ago, I believed that society owed me something because of my difficult childhood and bad circumstances, Marcus told the assembled media. I thought the world was responsible for fixing my problems. What James taught me is that while we can't control what happens to us, we are completely responsible for how we respond to those challenges. James, ever uncomfortable with publicity, kept his remarks brief. Marcus did the hard work of changing his life. I just provided support and believed in his ability to succeed. Any one of us could find ourselves in desperate circumstances. The question is, do we want a justice system that only punishes, or one that also heals and restores? Their business continued to flourish, with Second Chance Security becoming known throughout London for its innovative approach and remarkable success rate. They had expanded beyond traditional security consulting to include employment programs for former offenders, helping other people follow Marcus's path from criminal activity to productive citizenship. The most rewarding aspect of their work wasn't the financial success, but the letters they received from families whose lives had been touched by their story. Parents of troubled teenagers wrote to thank them for proving that people could change. Former criminals who had found hope in their example wrote to share their own stories of redemption. Victims of crime wrote to express their admiration for James's choice to respond to violence with compassion rather than revenge. 5 years after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus Thompson walked his daughter down the aisle at her wedding. Emma had asked James to serve as co-officiant alongside the traditional minister, recognizing the role he had played in restoring her father to their family. As Marcus placed Emma's hand in her fiancé's, he whispered words that only she could hear. "I'm sorry for all the years I missed, but I promise I'll be the grandfather your children deserve." James, now retired from his position as a palace guard, had found his true calling in the work he and Marcus had built together. He often reflected on that morning when a desperate man had lunged at him with a knife, wondering what might have happened if he had responded with violence instead of compassion. The ripple effects of that single moment of choosing understanding over anger had changed not just 2 lives, but had influenced criminal justice policy and inspired countless others to believe in the possibility of redemption. Their story became more than just a news sensation or legal precedent. It became proof that even in our darkest moments, when we feel most abandoned by society and consumed by despair, transformation remains possible. It demonstrated that sometimes the most profound act of strength is extending grace to someone who doesn't deserve it, and that true justice isn't just about punishment, but about healing the wounds that crime inflicts on everyone involved. Marcus Thompson never forgot the moment when Sergeant James Mitchell chose to see him as a human, being worth saving rather than a threat to be neutralized. That moment of unexpected compassion had literally saved his life, not just from prison, but from the spiritual death that comes from losing all hope in humanity's capacity for forgiveness and renewal. Their partnership proved that extraordinary things become possible when people choose courage over fear, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair. What had begun as one man's desperate attempt to matter to the world had become a testament to the transformative power of believing that everyone deserves a chance to write a better ending to their story.